I just met Edith yesterday, and we had a little chat, and she's an amazing woman. I'm really glad I met her. And it seems like we do very similar work. She just told me that she's written a book called The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, which is, I haven't read it, but it sounds awesome because this is exactly the field that I work in, which is also trauma therapy. And I'm going to recommend you read it, even though I haven't read it yet. So the title of this conversation that we're going to have is about happiness. And we're going to begin by, I'm going to ask Edith, how do you define happiness? What is happiness?
Thank you so much for, giving me the honor of having this conversation with me. And yes, we're talking about happiness, the secret, for survival, how happiness can be the secret of survival. And it's funny that you mentioned trauma, because you say, how can we talk about trauma and happiness at the same time? People ask me that a lot. And as a clinical psychologist, I've worked with a lot of people who have a lot of suffering, right? People only come to therapy when they're already suffering and not necessarily for prevention. I don't know if you have that experience too, as a therapist. And I say, wow, how can I talk, this is what I work every day with people that are having pain, that are having suffering, that are struggling, that are in survival mode. How can I be talking about happiness? And the interesting thing is that happiness and suffering are together. The acknowledging that life has suffering is part of the happiness. And realizing and recognizing that life has obstacles and adversities, and instead of avoiding them and pretending they're not there, and doing all kinds of things that we all do every day to put that away in whatever shape and form we do, right? We do all kinds of behaviors, addictive behaviors. We get angry, we run away, we get paralyzed, we do all kinds of things. We please people all day long so we don't suffer, or we let all these things happen so we don't suffer. And I'm telling you that when we embrace the things that happens to us instead of avoiding them, when we sit with whatever is happening to us, can be the beginning of happiness. So for me, the definition of happiness, there are so many definitions of happiness, and we're going to go through some of them. There's the Buddhist definition, there's the positive psychology definition of happiness. We're going to hear about the definition of happiness from the Jewish point of view. But one of the things that we know is that happiness it's not necessarily just a feeling. Happiness is a state of being. It's not like we can be happy, it's that we are happiness. It's not like, yeah, I'm happy, I'm not happy. That's a mood in the moment. But real happiness is a state of being. And I'll tell you some more about it. And it has to do with choices, has to do with attitude, it has to do with the kind of things that we do every day, it has to do with genetics. We'll go through some of that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say here is that happiness is a state of being. It's not just an idea or a feeling. Can you explain to me a little bit about what is the biological state of being of happiness?
So the biological piece of it is just one of the factors.
Okay.
There's a very well-known happiness researcher. Her name is Sonia Lubomirsky. She's at Stanford University. She's actually been invited by the Wellness Institute, so there are people here that, who knows Sonia Lubomirsky? Have anybody heard? Yes. So she says that we have 50% of our well-being comes from genetics. That's her research. And she says that 10% of our well-being comes from our life circumstances, things that we live through, we go through during the day and during our life. And we say, wow, if genetics is 50% and our life circumstances is 10%, what do we do, right? But the interesting thing about that is that there's a 40% left. And that 40% is the choices that we make. It's the attitudes that we have. It's what we make with our life every day. And that makes all the difference. And she has a lot of research on the different aspects that are related to that, like self-compassion, kindness, gratitude, really very specific things that allow for a state of happiness. So that's one example of, one woman that really has dedicated her life to the study of happiness. There are many more, and I'm going to be telling you some more about that.
Okay, that's very interesting. The idea that 50% of our happiness has to do with genetics and 10% has to do with, what did you say the other 10% was?
The life circumstances, and then 40% is a choice.
Mm-hmm. Very
is
interesting.
what we do with it.
Yeah. And I say that's very interesting because this is something that is actually contrary to what we believe in Judaism as far as happiness goes. What we believe as far as, from a Jewish perspective, is that everybody has the choice at any time, at any moment in their life to choose joy. And the Hasidic perspective on what joy is, which maybe we're talking about very different things, and this is why I started by defining happiness, because we can throw around a lot of English words, we can throw around a lot of ideas, but if we're not defining them, then we could be talking about different things, even though we're using the same words, right? So when you explained to me a little bit about what your idea of happiness is, and I'm just going to explain to you a little bit about what the Hasidic perspective of happiness is. And the Hasidic perspective of happiness is really the capacity to be fully present in the awareness that I am one with God and connected with all the life force and goodness that exists in the universe at any given time. And that any human being has the capacity to tap into that, to meditate on that, and to connect with that idea, and to really choose to, as a result of that, to allow all of the animal soul consciousness, which is really all of my fear-based programming that I live my life with all of the time, to zoom in into the background. It's a little bit like I zoom into one reality, I zoom into the divine reality, and my defense mechanisms can kind of zoom out of focus, even though they'll still be there in the background, they'll still be chatting in the back of my mind. But the more I choose to focus my attention on the divine reality, the more I'm able to become present with my experience of life. And the more present I am with my experience of life and with God as being present in my experience of life, the more joy I'm going to feel. And in fact, this is really, in Judaism, we have this concept which says, serve God with joy. And really what it's saying is that joy is our service of God, in a sense, that when we are in that expanded state, when we are in that connection with the divine, we are in a state of joy. It's synonymous with each other. There's no really gap between the two. As soon as we acknowledge and we have a felt sense or a spiritual experience of what we truly are, then the natural reaction to that is only joy.
I love it. Yes, and I know that, and I can tell you from the psychological world and the field of science, that is incorporated. And I'm going to tell you a story. You know what's so interesting? Psychology, for the longest time, including our very dear Sigmund Freud from our tribe, right? Focused on the very negative things that human beings would go through, and how much suffering and how much pain and all these symptoms of pathology. And then we have all these diagnoses, right, in medicine and in psychology. Right? Can you relate to what I'm saying? It's like everything that goes bad with us. We have a whole field of medicine and psychology that focuses on that in the Western world. And it's interesting because it's only recently, in the last few years, that we've decided to pay attention to what's positive with us, to the prevention, to what's going well with us, so we can continue to do it. So there's a very well-known psychologist called Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn. He actually was the president of the American Psychological Association. And he was very well known for studying learned helplessness. What is learned helplessness? is when you try constantly to achieve something, to do something, to be something, to on and on and on, and you keep getting punished and you keep getting bad results. And he says the origin of depression is learned helplessness. Because you have a little bit of motivation or you have a little bit of initiative and you try and then you fail. And then you try again and you fail. And you try again and things happen. And he says, this is what happens. People get into learned helplessness and they get so depressed. He dedicated his life to this learned helplessness thing. And then I don't know what happened in his personal life, but he decided that he had enough of the learned helplessness. He was going to look into something more positive. So he began to look into hopefulness, and he created the field of positive psychology. Imagine that. That was like a revolutionary concept to say, wow, psychology needs to have the word positive before to really think about what are the positive things. And from that place, there's been, like right now, we have a very, very well-developed field of positive psychology. Many of you probably know about that. So Martin Seligman said, happiness is, and of course he was doing a lot of research into happiness, and many people that study with him and that work with him, and one of them actually, Tal Ben-Shahar. Has anybody heard of Tal Ben-Shahar? Yes, he was a professor at Harvard University. Yes, my book. Yes, he's a good colleague of mine, and he supports me. Thank you for paying attention to that. His name is He was the professor at Harvard that was the most popular class. And guess what the class was about? It wasn't math. It wasn't geography. It wasn't biology. It was happiness. And it was to this day, I think. Now the professor, I think, who's teaching that is Arthur Brooks. Do you know Arthur Brooks? He's another really amazing guy. He writes, I think, in the Time magazine also, and he's also a professor of happiness. So Tal Ben-Shahar, who was a student, Martin Seligman, they come up with the concepts of happiness that absolutely include the very Jewish concept of joy and meaning. That's all these whole stories to say that even from the science perspective, the meaningful life is part of the concept of happiness. The other two parts of the concept of happiness are the pleasant life, meaning things that gives us pleasure, that gives us satisfaction, things that makes us feel good, and the engaged life, activities that are important for us, that have meaning, that have purpose. But the third part of this is the meaningful life, the being connected to something greater than ourselves, to really have to me sounds more like having the spiritual component. And this joy that Judaism talks about, tell me if this sounds to you, it comes from a very spiritual place. That it's a joy, that it's a spiritual joy. It's not the joy of I went on to the park and had fun. It's more like a spiritual and more from the soul. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think, if we were going to divide the different types of pleasure that a person can have in life, there's the very superficial pleasure that just satisfies our senses very temporarily in the moment that we're using that or interacting with that substance or that experience. And then leaves us looking for more afterwards. And then there are those deep pleasures that actually create a very deep sense of satisfaction inside of our souls and feed us and nourish us. And one of those very deep pleasures in life is learning information that inspires us, learning deep wisdom that gives us insight into our lives and into our journey, into our process. Specifically, in the concept in relation to Torah is learning Torah. The idea of really bonding with divine wisdom and really not learning things in a way that is just informational, but in a way that's deeply inspiring, deeply moving, deeply connecting and bonding to me, that really helps me feel deeply connected to my spiritual roots and core. In Tanya, it actually explains that this actually feeds the soul. It calls Torah learning food for the soul. When we actually learn it and we are able to integrate the information, not just learning it as a theory, but when we learn it and we feel it and we connect to it and it inspires us, it absorbs into our soul and nourishes it. Just like when you eat food, it absorbs into your body and nourishes you. And actually what it explains is that a hungry soul comes across as just like a hungry body can be irritable and annoyed and frustrated, just how we all get when we're hungry. A hungry soul does the same thing. It comes across as anxiety, as frustration, as feeling empty, feeling lack of purpose in life. And when we do fill our soul, when we do learn meaningful and spiritually connecting insights and information, it does bring a very deep sense of satisfaction, like having a good meal. And that's one of the very deep joys, very, very deep pleasures that come from intellectual awareness and understanding that can really deeply stay with us and be with us. And it doesn't kind of leave in the way that, if I just do something that's externally stimulating, the pleasure comes and goes. It can be very, very deeply satisfying for long periods of time and really changes us. It changes who we are and our perspective of life.
I love that. That makes me think of what is temporary and what is permanent in terms of happiness. Because that hungry soul, or that hungry body, or that hungry mind that wants something, how many times have we said, well, the minute I have millions of dollars, I'm going to be happy. The minute when I have the partner, that really loves me, that treats me the way I want it, that's when I'm going to be happy. When my children are going to behave exactly how I want them to behave and what I think is the right thing to do, that's when I'm going to be happy. Oh, when I have the work or the job that I really want, my dream work, that's when I'm going to be happy. Don't we say that all the time? People say that all the time. We do. And unfortunately,
very rarely is the case.
It's not the case. There's a lot of studies that have been done with people that win the lottery. You've heard about that? And what happens when people win the lottery? They're worse off? Better, the same?
They make a lot of new friends.
They make a lot of new friends. Winning the lottery can make you happy for 1 minute, right? It makes you happy when you get the news. It's like when buying a yacht, when buying a boat. The day you buy it and the day you sell it, right? Those are the two moments that make you happy. Yes, winning the lottery or getting the words that you want from your loved one or having that, what you thought you wanted. And you say, okay, when I have this, when I lose 20 pounds, that's when I'm going to be happy. Who identifies with that? When I get the way exactly what I wanted, I get in shape, that's when my life is going to be amazing. Those things are very, very, very temporary. Like so temporary that it can be hours of happiness, of days. But it doesn't last. It's not lasting. So there's so many studies that have shown that what we need to do in order to have this state of well-being, happiness as a state of being, has so much more to do with things that are not what we acquire. There's a formula that has been set for defining happiness. There are many people that come up with one of the formulas is the difference between our expectations and reality. And that's, what the difference between that is what happiness is. What do you think about that? So you have, the expectations that you have and what reality is, the more they coincide, the happier you are. The more different they are, the less happy you are. What do you think about that?
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I had a very similar statement that I used for teaching, which is actually stress is the gap between where we think we should be and where we truly are, which is an interesting spin on it, that's actually, how you would define happiness. And I wanted to ask you a question based on the reason that this conversation is called happiness is the key to survival.
Yeah, the secret.
The secret to survival. And you were explaining to me yesterday, and I've heard about this a lot, and you've done a lot more research on this, which is a fascinating concept of this idea in the world called blue zones. Blue zones are places in the world where people actually live very, very long and healthy lives. Up until the majority of people live up until their 90s or early hundreds with a lot of health and vigor. And so there was a study done by National Geographic where they actually wanted to understand what is it about these communities around the world. I think you studied about 5 of these communities. What makes the people in these communities actually really live long lives and healthy lives? They don't get sick towards the end of their lives. And so there was some very interesting research that came out of it, of what was it that helped these people to really survive, to live, not only survive, but thrive, to really live good lives. And you've done a lot of studying on these communities.
I've been to those places.
You've been to those communities. I'd love to hear about them.
Yes, I want to tell you some stories about that.
Yeah.
Has anybody seen that documentary? Yes? The Blue Zones? Or have you heard about the Blue Zones? Yes. Where do you think are the Blue Zones, the people that haven't seen the documentary? Blue Zones are places in the world where people are healthiest, happiest, and live the longest. Where do you think that is? Where? I can't hear. Sweden, what? Yeah, but don't the ones that don't know. What? Yeah, but you saw the documentary. People that haven't seen the documentary, where do you think are the happiest places? Japan? Iceland? Which one? Not a big city. Israel? Any other guess? Miami? London? It's interesting because they were looking around different cultures, different places, and seeing what makes a difference between people that live longer, with people that live not so long, people that live happier. And they found at least 5 places that were really, really special. And they were special because they kept seeing consistently how people were living and thriving. So as you say, the people that know, that have seen it, what is it, Japan? What else? Okinawa in Japan, what else? Costa Rica, Nicoya in Costa Rica, where else? Loma Linda in California. In Italy, what was it called in Italy? I forgot. Somewhere in Italy, I can't remember the name. And in Greece also. These were the 5 places. No, they haven't yet, but that might be an interesting place. And what they see, and I'm going to tell. Should I tell a story of the guy that went to? There was this very a person that was a Greek man that was living, I think, in London. I think it was, and he worked really, really, really hard. And when he was in his 70s, he got diagnosed with cancer. And the doctors were saying, we're not, this is the treatments, these are the protocols, these are the things. And he said, you know what? I'm already 70. I'm not going to go through that. I'm just going to go back to my country, say goodbye to everybody, because I want to be buried in Greece. That's what I'm going to do. So he took his stuff, the little that he managed to take. He goes to Greece, to this place in Greece, and he lived in the fields. He started to say hi to his family that was there, his friends that were there. He established himself there, meaning like he would walk everywhere. He started to cultivate some food that he would eat from the earth, from the ground. He would go up and down because, it was a hilly place, so he would go up and down, and to one side he didn't have a car. And he would just, every day he would see his family, he would see friends, and he announced to everybody, I came here to die. But a month went by, a year went by, years went by, and the guy was doing actually better. He didn't die. And this is one example of what was happening. And they were able to come up with at least 5 or 6 really criteria that make people happy. And one was, and healthier, one was movement. And movement is walking up and down, dancing, stretching, jumping. Doesn't matter what movement. And by the way, I'm telling you secrets right now. These are the secrets. The second is having a purpose. You know this, and Judaism says that, right? Having a purpose in life, waking up every morning and knowing why you're waking up and what you're doing, what's the meaningful thing to do. Stress, as you said, right? You said about how we manage stress and the difference in stress. Eating. And of course, eating, most of these places are plant-based, meaning like they didn't eat that much meat. I'm not advocating one or the other. I'm just saying this is what they found. Alcohol was not so much. It was very moderate. But most important, sleeping, they slept really well and peacefully. But the most important three that I really like is social relationships, having a community, and having good, family and friends that they would see on a regular basis. I don't know if you heard the woman in the Sapir in the other room that was talking about her survival, and she was talking about her boyfriend, and she said something that was very beautiful. She said that her boyfriend, who's still a hostage in Israel, in Gaza, unfortunately, one of the special things she knows about him and that she loves so much is that every day at 3 o'clock, no matter what, he would make coffee, right, and bring anybody to come drink coffee and share coffee and talk and share. And I thought, wow, that makes a person really special, and that makes a person bring so much happiness around. And that really, this is what she remembers about him, that something that stands out, like how you bring so much happiness with people around. So these are things that we know in the blue zones.
You were saying that you've been to Bhutan.
Yeah, so I'm part of one of the things that I do, because I work with so much trauma and suffering, I also am part of the World Happiness Foundation. The World Happiness Foundation is an amazing organization we started 10 years ago with the founders called Luis Gallardo. He was supposed to be here with me today, but he's stuck in India doing some happiness stuff over there. And some of the things that, our mission with the World Happiness Foundation is to create a world with less misery and suffering and more freedom, consciousness, and happiness for the world. And we've really have gone to many places in the world to learn, how people are happy and what people do to be happy. One of the most amazing places that we learn from is Bhutan. Have you heard of Bhutan, anybody? It's a tiny little country I was telling you about yesterday, a tiny little country in between India and China. And Bhutan calls themselves the happiest country in the world, but partly because their constitution is based on happiness and well-being. They have a happiness minister, the Minister of Happiness. They do. They have really very strict rules into how to check happiness for their citizens on a regular basis. They are a country that instead of measuring the gross domestic product, GDP, they have gross national happiness, GNH. Can you believe that? It's an actual thing, GNH, gross national happiness. What? They're not such a rich country, and that's one of the things and that really makes a difference. And they're a small country, so it must be. We interviewed people. They have a king. They have all kinds of things set up to make it a happy country. But this is the kind of things that we can learn from millennial, from cultures that have had that for so many years. Costa Rica also is another place that we were in Nicoya, and how people live to more than 100, and how people are happy and what kind of things, what happens in the culture. And I'm very proud to say that I think our Judaism has that within the culture. That it's not just what I see with Buddhism or what I see with the natives of Costa Rica or in Italy, but I think our Judaism has that integrated. The happiness, that kind of meaningful happiness is integrated into who we are. And I wanted to know if you have any thoughts about that too.
I think in theory it does, but I think in everybody's personal lives they have their own unique struggles. And we can say what the ideal in Judaism is, but then we also have the reality on the ground of people who are lonely, and people who wish that they lived in communities like that, and people who really have a lot of stresses in their lives that they wish that they could just let them go and live in Bhutan, or go back to Greece and live in the mountains, and for whatever reason they have circumstances in their lives that don't allow them to do that. And the question is, does that mean that they are now limited in their happiness capacity? Does that mean that now they can't develop and they can't find that deep space of happiness within themselves? I would say that absolutely not. I think that we need to learn that even though these things are so wonderful, in the sense that it's amazing to see how definitely taking care of our bodies and regulating our nervous systems and sleeping enough and eating good nourishing food and being with connected people, and it was definitely going to expand our capacity to connect and be joyful in our lives. And also when we don't have these circumstances and we're not gifted and privileged enough to live in such conditions, definitely if there's what we can do to help ourselves have that more, that would be awesome. Like if we did have things that were in our circle of choice that we could improve and that we could, then absolutely we need to do that and ask ourselves the questions of what gets in the way of me being able to do that. And also to know that having a deep sense of meaning, having a deep sense of connection with God, having the capacity to, on a daily basis, regulate my nervous system, connect with myself, nurture and nourish myself, and be present with what is in my life, rather than, again, trying to go. I think whenever we hear anything like this, sometimes our defense mechanisms hijack it and say, okay, then just like you were saying, that like that's my happiness. You know, you were saying in the beginning, there's no there for happiness. Yeah. And what we can do is we can hear, okay, when I live in a blue zone, then I'll be happy. We can go down that road, and it can just basically hijack the whole concept here.
Right.
Or we can just say, where I am right now, I can make that my inner blue zone. Like in my own life, in my own heart, in my own experience, in my own home, what can I do to add more blueness to it? How can I create more community in my own inner, all my inner voices inside of my own head, in my own emotions, you being able to connect with all the different parts of my own being, and taking a 3 o'clock break and offering them coffee and saying, how you doing, guys? That would be a nice way of
absolutely love that. I love that.
And definitely nourishing ourselves with really good food is a very good way to go. We can always access that, even if we don't have a garden where we're growing food inside, that we can pick up. And it would be great if you did have space to work with the soil. Is so good for our bodies. There's microbes and all sorts of things inside of the soil that literally, I think they did studies on gardening where people who garden are happier. So if you don't have a garden like me, I don't have much of a garden. My garden is mostly patio. I have over 80 houseplants. That's my way of gardening. And I love cutting bits off and then repotting them and growing them again. And I love feeling the soil. It gives me so much joy.
Beautiful.
Just to be in contact with the soil. And I can spend hours getting lost in it. And that's a beautiful way of being able to bring it into, if you live in the city and you live in a life, just to bring it in, that's a really beautiful way of doing it. And eating more wholesome food can just start with just eating more vegetables, buying things that are locally grown, and just trying to incorporate them more into our diets. The food that we eat really has, every food that we ingest has an energy underneath it. It has an impact on our bodies. And if you're eating food that comes from the ground, it's going to give you a very grounding, very nourishing, peaceful energy inside of your body. You're going to actually feel more grounded and more present. And when you eat food that's been highly processed, highly chemicalized, lots of sugar and high content, you're going to feel buzzed, you're going to feel disoriented, you're going to feel like your nervous system is going to be highly wired. And that deep sense of peace really can come from incorporating into our lives more whole foods and more foods that grow in the ground, really grounding us and bringing us into a deep state of peace.
Yeah, I would take it even further, that it's not just the food, but when I first was asked, what is the concept of happiness for me, and what brings happiness, or what allows me to facilitate happiness in my everyday life, the contact with nature is fundamental. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, for example, I did during COVID, that we were all trapped in our little worlds, is that I would go on walks and really take my time to look at the trees, look at the flowers, hug the trees. I'm a tree hugger. Talk to the fish in the sea that were there. I don't know, there were more fish, more flowers, more birds, more everything. And that really, if we stop for a little bit, if we pause, if we go a little bit slower and stay in touch, connect with nature at any level. I do it as a practice. I have the privilege of living in Miami. I go to the beach for a walk, even at nighttime, just to be in nature. If you have a mountain, if you have a forest, if you have anything, when you have trees, a park, using that, it makes all the difference in the world. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's a very, very important research that has been going on for 80 years in terms of what happiness is and what is well-being and what makes a difference between people that are happier and not and that live longer. And it's been done by Harvard University, and it's been really lasting for 80 years. They've been following people. Some of them have died and other people have come. And they look into education, religion, material belongings, a level of financial level, economic, family members, where they live. They looked at many, many different variables, and this is an ongoing study. Has anybody heard about this study? You're like my best students right here. You know everything. But what they find out, what really makes a difference for people that are happier and live longer, this is separate from the blue zones, but it's another really well-known study that has been going on. What do you think it is? The amount of books that people have? What do you think makes a difference? Like, there's one thing that people found. People that have the best relationships with friends and family members, not necessarily biological, but chosen, either, but the people that had the best relationships are the ones that have lived longer and have reported to be happier. Can you believe that? Above everything else. The relationships that we have. That's why relational intelligence is so important. That's why relationships, cultivating relationships with ourselves, with others, is key to our happiness. Yes. Did you hear a little bit what she said? She was saying, like, how do we turn our kids into why there's so much discomfort and anger and even anti-Semitism, and they're so angry and they're so not happy with themselves, right, and with others, and how do we turn that around? And what I was going to say, and I'm going to answer that in a minute because this is related. When we talk about happiness, and I was hearing you talk, you reminded me so much of, it's not just what we do every day and how we eat, and it's like it starts with education. What do we do with our children? In Bhutan, in every school, children start their lives with a meditation every morning. Yeah. They teach children meditation from the very, very beginning. I'm not saying that's the only way, but that's one way. So instead of punishing them or sending them a timeout, whatever, they do a little meditation. They go play, and when they come back, let's say they have a break, they come back to sit down and study, they do 10-minute meditation before they begin studying again. They calm the nervous system. They come back to themselves. These are little things that are not at all integrated into our education. Our education is lacking so much of that holistic way of seeing what you're talking about, food. You know, how our schools in general, what kind of food they're bringing, what kind of things they're... So this makes a huge difference in how we're entering life, how we are as parents, what are we teaching our children, what kind of things are we showing our children. And for me, this is a whole other presentation that maybe we can do next time, but the key for me to the difference of what's happening with our kids right now, thank you, yes, to our kids right now is social media. And it's not because social media is all bad all the time, but there's a key thing that happens with social media, and it's comparison. When these kids are in constant comparison with others, you said a word that you said they feel like less, they feel resentful. I don't remember what you said. It was like but you said something like they feel constantly like they're lacking, it's never enough. And when you're constantly in this Instagram and TikTok, and you're seeing others. In this comparison, you're constantly comparing yourself with others. And we adults, this affects everyone, children and adults. The other is doing and what am I lacking and how the other is having and what constant comparison. It has a lot of damage.
Can I add something here? I think that we can talk in theory about how to help, in theory, the ideas of the world, which sometimes we do when we feel helpless and we feel like there's nothing that we can do. How can we change a whole community's attitude? How can we change the whole world's craziness? What can we actually practically do to help? And there's a really beautiful idea in Hasidus which can really help us feel less helpless and less just kind of talking in theory about these things, but actually practically doing something that can help us on a real practical level. And this concept in Hasidus is explained that there are specific frequencies and energies in the world. There are specific, I would say, like communal consciousnesses that exist in the world. For example, a specific frequency, let's say, of anger. Anger is something that a lot of human beings, or most human beings, experience within themselves. But it's also a frequency that exists in the communal consciousness of the universe. And every single time I feel anger, but I act on my anger, I build strength, and I actually contribute to the collective consciousness of anger in the universe. And every single time I feel that anger inside of myself, and instead of acting on it, I breathe, and I regulate my nervous system, and I make a choice to communicate effectively rather than with that anger. I actually diminish the universal consciousness of anger that exists in the universe. So I'm not only doing my own inner work, and I'm not only impacting my own little world, I'm actually impacting and weakening the strength of that consciousness that exists all around me. And every single one of us is extremely powerful as a human being. A human being consciousness is so extremely powerful. Do not underestimate what power you have in your own mind and in your own thoughts and the work you can do on a universal level. So I would say that every single time we see, let's say, the pain of another person, let's say you're looking at the youth of the world and we're looking at the dysfunction that's around us, and ask ourselves the question, what is the dysfunction that's happening here, and where do I see that inside of myself? And if I can see even a slight correlation between something in the way that I relate to myself and my inner world, and I do the inner work of acknowledging it and having compassion on it, and then also choosing not to act on it, choosing to act in line with a higher value system that I have, what I'm doing is I'm collectively, practically in my own little world, in my own little house, nobody knows about it, but the universal consciousness knows about it, and I am actually actively helping every other person in the universe that struggles with the same thing as me. When I overcome a struggle like this in my own consciousness, every other person who's struggling with anger is now going to have an easier time of it because of the time that I regulated my nervous system and I was able to bring myself back into alignment and not yell at that person I so wanted to yell at, or didn't criticize that person or judge that person or compare myself. When I look at other people and I'm comparing myself to other people and I'm seeing how, like the social media thing, like they're better than me and going down a spiral of thinking of myself as not being great, and I say, hold on a second. This is what we call in Hasidic philosophy a klippa. It's a shell energy. It's not true. It's falseness that we live in this world. And I say, that isn't true. I am a divine spark. I am godly. And I have absolute energy and power and light that I'm here to shine in the world. And I'm going to choose to do that. I help every single other person in the universe who's struggling with the exact same struggle as me. And that is the most unbelievable, powerful, and empowering thing that we can do for ourselves and do for the universe, in response to any kind of dysfunction that we might witness or see in anybody around us. So we don't have to sit on the sidelines and say, wow, the world is chaotic, the world is crazy, the world is just, it's whatever. We can say all sorts of things, or we can say, hold on a second, there's an opportunity here for me. I wonder what it's here to show me. And I wonder, this brings us a deep sense of purpose, which brings us a deep sense of meaning, which brings us to a deep sense of happiness as well. That I know I can make a difference, and I know I can be effective in the world.
Yeah, I think this thing of regulating our emotions is so important. And if we can teach our children one thing, is to teach our children how to regulate themselves. self-soothing.
Starts with
and
regulating ourselves.
Yes, we have to
The
start with ourselves so
We
we
have
can
to
teach
start
our
with
children.
ourselves, yes.
Absolutely. I think
By
you and I
actually
always
learning
agree
how
on
to
that.
do it ourselves, our
Yes.
children learn from watching and observing us more. If I'm sitting with my child and I'm saying, calm down, that's
And
not going to tell
screaming
them
at them.
anything. But if I'm deeply calm and deeply
Yes.
peaceful in myself and I'm able to hold space for whatever the tantrum is happening until it calms down, my child will learn how to self-regulate so much quicker.
Absolutely.
So really it starts with, everything starts with our own inner
So
landscape,
cultivating
inner world, yeah.
cultivating that is a key element to our happiness. And the other one is, I think some of you mentioned that connection. That connection is not only to ourselves, but the connection, a spiritual connection that is not necessarily religious, but it can be religious too. But it's a connection to something greater than ourselves. To know that we are part of a whole, that we're something bigger. There are amazing studies done by Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia University that have found that people that have developed a sense of spirituality have that as a protective factor for future traumatic events. And I think that's something we can teach our children as well, and we can allow for developing for ourselves and others, in which when we have this sense of connection and when we have this spirituality, there's even like a physiological aspect of it. People that are more spiritual have their prefrontal cortex. There's a part of it that it gets thickened. You can actually see it on the MRIs. And when we have that, it allows us to navigate adversity in a better way. It allows us to be almost like a protective factor. And in children, they've seen this even more. It helps even more when children have this. So these are some of the secrets that we're sharing about happiness. That's one of the things that I've seen is that people have gone through the darkest of the darkest times can come out to the highest of the most sustained happiness. I know it's a contradiction, but I've seen it happen a lot. Because when you go to the darkest, when you break the most, if you really go through the journey and the process of healing, those are people that you see that have the most gratitude, the most appreciation for life, the most consciousness, and they really can achieve that sustained happiness the best. For me, that's what I call post-traumatic growth. And my invitation to you really is to embrace that trauma and to say, yes, I was happy, but now that I have this trauma, the only thing I can do is sit with it, radically accept it, and begin your journey of healing. Because if you know that's a choice, like Viktor Frankl had a choice in the concentration camps, like people that have gone through really the hostages in Israel, that the war, when we go through that, if you embrace that trauma and you say, I'm willing to process it, I'm willing to walk through it, I'm willing to learn from it, you can get to very, very high levels of happiness.
Thank you so much, Edith. Glory. What a wonderful session.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.